So you are suggesting that, yes, this thing could potentially transform. And I like the line where you guys write that if the rules of origin thing is sorted out, and if all the tariffs that we're talking about are dropped, we could see at least between 1 and 3 percentage point gain in African economies. I was amazed. In each country. How would that happen? Tell me.
Well, as you know, the rules of origin are key to making any preferential free trade area work.
You actually need to educate me about the rules of origin.
Okay, the rules of origin are like a passport. They're a passport that determine and guarantee the origin of a particular product or good from
So it's a
within
passport for goods.
Exactly, it's a passport for goods. Now, every free trade area needs this, so you know that the goods that you're giving the preferences to your neighbor for are coming from your neighbor. Without this, no free trade area can really work properly.
Okay.
And these are what are being negotiated at the moment, and this is what we are discussing in the report that we're discussing today.
Right. So you are saying these discussions are taking place now. Between who?
Between member states of the African
That have signed up or that have ratified?
Not just the ones that have, yes, the ones who have ratified the agreement, yes.
Okay. And how far are those negotiations? And I also want to get a sense of the time that it will take, you think, to try to wrap it up.
The negotiations are due to be completed at the end of this month. Now, as to whether or not they will be is still debatable.
Yes.
In our report, we talk about the way in which these rules of origin, if carefully crafted, could really help to boost trade by 33%, can really help deliver the GDP growth gains that you talked about of 3%. Sure. Across the board.
So lay down the ground rules of what needs to be done and how they ought to look for it to come into effect.
It's a hideously complex issue, but we think that the rules of origin need to be simple, transparent, predictable, and business friendly.
And they're anything but simple.
They're not simple, but if they can be made simple so that more firms will utilize them and access them, if they can be made predictable, which will support investment that supports the growth of trade in the continent, if they can be made predictable, because as you know, most investment has a long lead time, and especially business friendly, so firms across the continent can and will choose to use the AFCFTA for doing its business and its trade, then it can really, really deliver benefits. You know, Africa currently only trades amongst itself about 15% of its total trade, whereas in Europe it's 67%. There's a big potential there that the AFCFTA could deliver to boost intra-African trade that will release more investment and potentially jobs.
Yeah, and here I was thinking, since the 22 that were required to ratify have already done the deed, we are flying. Now we are seeing an increase in intra-African trade. It is suggesting that this could well scupper that. But I want to talk about what needs to go into these rules. What do they contain? Because I think, reading up on your report, I see there ought to be amounts of local products that you measure and stuff like that. What goes into that?
In our report, we think that the rules of origin need to be conducive to development of regional.
What do they contain? Yeah, please.
So the rules of origin should contain guidelines which enable firms to be able to process, adopt, and adapt products to the market that meet a common criteria to promote trade. Now, for example, we look at this in the context of cocoa. Let's take cocoa, for example. We look at 6 commodities.
Yes.
We know that in the west of Africa, there's high levels of raw cocoa production. 75% of that cocoa is exported to non-African countries.
Switzerland and all of them.
Exactly. Whereas in southern Africa and in Egypt, we know that there's a lot of chocolate production.
And consumption.
And consumption, of course. And yet neither of these two areas, these two regional economic communities, are properly linked.
Right.
And we think that there's potential, real trade creation potential, if you can get the rules of origin right, which make the costs of that trade more competitive and lower for the producers in Ghana and more attractive for the consumers of that potential product to make chocolate in Southern African firms.
And key, of course, once they've agreed on the rules of origin, key to their success is the ability of the states themselves to manage them and then adhere to their rules, right?
Yes, implementation is obviously going to be a challenge. And in the report, we talk a lot about...
And we know about the inefficiencies of our borders and our ports and all those other things.
Absolutely. And the great thing about this is that, you know, that if we get the implementation right, that means building capacity at the customs border.
Yeah.
That means thinking about the application of new technology, such as e-certification. That means maybe adapting new means of verification of trade and produce that we see in other sorts of free trade areas. If we can get these kinds of things right as part of the implementation process, then yes, the uptake could be quite profound for firms.
So just explain one thing before, for me before you go. So obviously you want to make sure that when you say rules of origin, they in part, I suppose, determine what product is deemed to be, say, made in South Africa or made in Mozambique and that kind of thing. What determines that?
The negotiations will determine that.
Or the content that goes into it.
The content it goes into it. So there are various rules. I don't really want to make it too complicated, but there are various rules which determine which proportion of what is produced where counts for being of origin within a given free trade area.
Right.
Let me give you an example. For example, South Africa makes a lot of cars. Most of the cars it makes are exported outside of the continent.
Yes.
However, many of the inputs that come into that car as intermediates cannot be sourced on the continent.
Yes.
For various reasons. Partly it's cost, partly it's infrastructure, lack of a technology in your partners. So the rules of origin have to be crafted so that for that particular sector, for example, it doesn't make the costs of firms producing cars in South Africa too high if they have to import intermediates from outside the continent.
Right.
But at the same time, we want to stimulate amongst African countries with that potential to enter that market and provide those intermediates. The CFTA can potentially do that by reducing some of the costs of trade and ancillary investment in this regard.
Absolutely. You're also talking about its impact on regional, in building regional value chains. How would that work very quickly?
Its impact on regional value chains is through trade creation. So if the rules of origin, for example, for a given sector, let's take cocoa, for example, are crafted in such a way that they create the opportunities for producers in country A to reduce the costs through tariffs, lower tariffs, for example, or more preferences of facilitating trade with their neighboring countries, you can build more trade creation for the produce that you're trading with your neighbor, because it becomes costlier, it becomes cheaper, and becomes easier because you have fewer barriers to entry and to the trade.
Junior, you have just depressed me, because where I was thinking these guys are flying, I'm saying this thing is going to take a lot longer before we begin to see volumes in production and potentially perhaps the industrialization of Africa we were all dreaming about coming into play. But thanks for coming in and explaining.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.